All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the WGA's first panel in our Controversy at Noon series, hopefully the first of many. Unfortunately, Valentine Goodard won't be able to participate in this panel this afternoon, but we're really looking forward to hearing what the rest of our panelists have to say on the topic of AI. I'm Ashley Mann, the Program and Operations Coordinator, and I just have a few housekeeping things to mention before we get started. Number one, the panel is being recorded. It will be added to our YouTube channel at a future date for viewing, so just please keep that in mind. Number two, please keep your mics muted and cameras turned off during the discussion. If there's time, which we should have at the end of the panel, we'll open it up to questions. At that time, if you could type your questions into the chat, that would be ideal. That way we can see everybody and just make sure that things are getting monitored fairly. And lastly, maybe most importantly, if you would like to see future iterations of our Controversy at Noon series, I will put a link in the chat that explains all the different ways you can help support the WGA. Donations are always welcome. All right, that's it for me. I'm going to pass it off to Dustin now.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining the Controversy at Noon, the effects of AI on writers and the literary world. I'll start off with a land acknowledgement. The Writers Guild of Alberta acknowledges that the land on which we live, work, and tell stories is located on treaty territory, and we respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples in Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. My name is Dustin Archibald. I am a former president of the Writers Guild of Alberta for the board of directors. I'm a writer, and I'm also an editor of books on technology such as artificial intelligence and quantum computing. Just as a reminder that Westward, the WGA's writing publication, will be featuring articles and discussions on AI in its next upcoming issue, so keep an eye out for that. And if you're not signed up for the Westward, I'd really recommend that you sign up for it and take a look at that issue. So I'd like to introduce our panelists today. Coming first, we have Brenda McDermott, and we have Catherine Abbas. So two experts in artificial intelligence, and maybe if we can have Brenda, if you can just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your experience with AI.
Hi there. So my name is Brenda McDermott. I don't know if I would say I'm a writer unless we want to go into some academic writing stuff. But where I come to this is from a project that we're doing at the University of Calgary, looking at the ethics of academic integrity meeting artificial intelligence. And where I come to this kind of topic is thinking about, how is this a tool? How can we think about this from a teaching and learning perspective? And in particular, I'm very interested on how is this perhaps something that can help us with equity in our educational system and the ways in which that sometimes we have created barriers around language, and how might tools like AI actually help people express themselves?
All right, great. And Catherine?
Yeah, I am a writer, an Edmonton-based writer. I also work for Reimagine AI, which is a creative studio that works with different kinds of AI to create, art-based projects. But we're also working within like healthcare and other kinds of, I guess, landscapes, bringing AI to people. And I script the personalities of the bots, essentially, is what I do. So kind of trying to bring that quote unquote human touch to the different virtual beings that we create for the projects that we do. And I've been with this studio for about a year as a creative writer for AI. So yeah, just some contradictions within, I think, even what I do within the realm of writing and AI. But yeah, I'm still pretty new to it. Yeah.
All right, great. So I'd like to just dive right into it. And the first question that always comes up is, what is AI? What is artificial intelligence? Who would like to take that one first? Because I know that is a broad subject. Brenda, how about we just start with you?
Okay, so I think I channel other people here when I say we call it artificial intelligence, but what we're really talking about are large language models that have been trained on a whole bunch of digital texts to create these models. And often they're traditionally have been trained on either things on the internet, the Gutenberg project, and such. So it's actually not intelligent yet. It's really just the product of machine-based learning and some really fascinating math that I don't fully understand, that takes the relationships between words and tries to actually like create vectors of them or create ideas of connections and relationships from them. While it's very exciting and it seems very new, but we've had principles of large language models, natural language processing, and you've had it in your cell phone. So when you've had that word prediction, word suggestion tool, you've been using baby AI for probably a bit longer than you realize.
Catherine, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think like even the example of, back in earlier versions of Microsoft Word, having your little paperclip buddy offering suggestions and such. I think that the way I try to conceptualize, at least like the AI kind of that I work with, each virtual being kind of has, two sections of the brain is how I like to picture it. And one is kind of plugged into a network of information and allows the AI to answer, basic fact-based questions. And then the other half of it is that personality that, I'm going to use air quotes every time I say that, because we are talking about, something that is artificially created. And, like a lot of what I do to create a personality for a bot, has to do with how we get to know the personality of a person in real life. So it's a lot of questions and answers, scripting, hundreds of questions. The more questions, the more nuanced a personality you can create for this virtual being. And then creating answers that correspond and trying to create consistency, especially when you are interacting with the bot and maybe you're asking of it something that is outside of those two sides of the brain that we work with or that we program. So I'm really interested in kind of like that gray space, the in-betweens, I guess, in terms of, working with something that is artificially created, and whatever we infuse as humans in our interactions with this kind of, technology, really.
So that's really, really interesting. We brought up the idea of large language models. What other types of artificial intelligence are affecting writers today? Brenda, if you could just go ahead and jump in there.
I think one of the challenges that I think many groups are having with these large language models is the way that it or any of I think of them as generative AI, so AI that creates something new, is in some respect the way in which, unless you use a constitutional AI, and a constitutional AI is something that like it's got the model and you're not training it as you use it. So they're very particular ones and they're very hard to get into Canada access. So something like Claude Monet is a constitutional AI, but the ones that are most easy and most of us are playing with, it's learning from us as we go along. And so if you have a distinctive style, you have an idea, once you've started interacting with the tool, you don't know where that idea has gone and who else it may be shared with. So in terms of kind of who owns what, or even just your own privacy, I think it's always a very complicated idea once we start playing with the tool.
That's a good point. The idea of privacy and who owns what in terms of an artificial intelligence algorithm. Catherine, do you have any ideas about different types of AI that writers are going to be running into now as we run forward?
I think back to my time in like high school English classrooms where I was teaching different types of creative writing, personal writing, and I think maybe in some sense lucky to have kind of exited that seen prior to the explosion of something like ChatGPT, where you see a lot of issues with plagiarism, and appropriation of ideas through ChatGPT on things like essays and tests and stuff like that. And I think that a lot of it, has to do from, again, like a personal standpoint, like what are we missing from the generative AI? And it's a lot of it is that human touch, feeling, emotion that comes with experience, like lived experience of being human. And so in terms of writing, like in my teaching with the high school students that I worked with, a lot of it was like building confidence in the writer themselves, in their own ideas, so that the temptation to go elsewhere for for other people's ideas is less, I guess, prominent. I don't know that is necessarily the answer for everybody. And of course, we're still going to be using AI and generative AI to facilitate different, kinds of things, tasks in our lives. But yeah, in terms of writing, I think a lot of it does kind of come back to, at least for me and how I conceptualize it, like how do we continue to place like the human and what makes the human at the center, and then use AI again as a tool, more than a solution to problems that we might have with our own writing, or our own confidence in our own abilities to express ourselves.
So we brought up the idea of generative AI quite a bit here. And ChatGPT is one of these generative AI type systems. Can we maybe just delve into a bit more about what generative AI is, and really, not really how it works, because that's a lot of work, but just a high level view about how it works, and really the effects it has on when you're trying to compose some sort of text. Brenda, can you just start off with that?
I'll do my best here. I think when I think of generative AI, I often think about it, the idea that it's creating something. So generative AI can include things like written text. It can also include tools like Midjourney, which will create images. And so the idea is that you start off with a prompt or a parameter or an interaction, and then it's generating something for you, whether that be text or an image. Key to all of this is it's usually not a one and done. It's usually an iterative process. So often you're doing multiple prompts and refining it. So you're getting one piece from it and you're going, I liked what you did here, but not so much there. Can you redo this with this? Or can you simplify the language? So there's often a series of interactions trying to get towards a product that's meeting more the expectation.
Okay, can you fill in a bit more of that idea, Catherine, about meeting the expectation that you have when you do a prompt, when you submit a prompt to a generative type system? Really, what are you trying to get out of it when you do this?
Yeah, you're trying to get something tailored to your purpose or your motivation. And I think Midjourney is a good example. And I've worked with Midjourney in my own I've interacted with Midjourney in my own work, and it's really interesting to see what it's like any kind of conversation, what kind of stands out to the listener, and how the AI will interpret a prompt that you give it. So even making certain adjustments. So if I say, I want to generate an image of a basketball team playing basketball on the moon, and one team's in red and one team's in blue, I can include all the details I want, but it's really out of my hands, at least the first few goes, what Midjourney decides to focus on, especially if you include different styles that you'd like it to kind of create an image in the image of. And I think with ChatGPT and using ChatGPT as like a generative kind of tool, you see the same thing. So, you can ask ChatGPT for a handful of writing prompts, and they'll spit out something quite generic with a generic ask like that. But then the more nuanced, the more refined you make your request, the more nuanced and refined those results are going to be. And I think that's kind of the learning or the intelligent part of AI.
And so your work deals a lot with personality. Can you kind of just speak to that how personality is generated when you're using generative AI?
Yeah, so I use generative AI a little bit less in like the composition of the personality in the bots that I create. Often, again, I think I mentioned earlier, it's a lot of questions and answers. So, you know, you could start with a base bot that has 100 predetermined questions in there, all that have to do with personality. So what's your favorite color? What's your favorite season? Do you like shopping? Like all these kinds of, you know, baseline questions. And then you'd script the answers and you know, in the work that I do, I give multiple answers for the same question so that you can create a bit of a sense of voice for a character. You know, so same question asked maybe different ways will generate a slightly different answer each time. So, you know, maybe the being is consistent in the fact that pepperoni pizza is their favorite, but the way they communicate that with you in their answer is going to be a little bit different every time. And that's a lot to do with the large language model that's kind of backing it up or giving it, you know, the power. And then, you know, of course, the more nuanced you want to make that bot, that virtual being, the more questions and answers you have to compose to just fill in those kinds of gaps. So, you know, you could have 1,000 questions in there and still there will be gaps, of course, but you're trying to create, or I'm trying to create consistency within that character and look for places where, yeah, perhaps you know, is there a way that the question about pizza that can be asked that will you know, generate a response that's not pepperoni, and then what do we do with that, and how do we kind of plug that hole? So it's a lot of really like detailed work, I would say, but it all has to do with language and you know, especially when you're working kind of from a base bot, you can think about what kinds of personality traits you would want that virtual being to have. So, you know, you could build a bot that's got a bit of sass or a bit of you know, like attitude. You can create a bot that's a little bit more meek or mild, and all of that has to do with the language that I would choose to respond to questions. Yeah, so that's pretty much the process.
And so when you talk about a bot, that's like a program, right?
A bot, yeah, I'm using like bot and virtual being interchangeably, I guess. Like our, you know, any kind of lots of the bots that we have will have kind of like visual like an image of what they look like if they're a creature or a human type character. But yeah, each bot is like its own entity, its own being, its own personality, if you will.
Okay, great. So this is where we get to the controversy at noon part. So where does the controversy on AI and writing come from? So what are the main concerns? And I'm going to ask Brenda to start that discussion off here.
Well, I think one of the first concerns that comes out is recognizing that the large language models, the things that are the basis of most of these tools, are the products of human beings. It was trained on like a sort of like imagine it like a Pac-Man went through a library. That's how I imagine the learning process. It just keeps eating this. And there are all sorts of flaws and stereotypes and biases in what it was fed. And so it is no better than us human beings in terms of when it produces things out, it is going to produce out things that create that bias. So an experiment I have to have students do is say, okay, pick a profession and ask ChatGPT to write you a story about it, and then just keep regenerating it. So if you ask it to do it for nurses, you actually get all female names for that nurse character. It's a little bit better with doctor, but again, it's that same kind of formulaic thing. It's going through and it's picked up that bias. The other thing I think in particular for interest for writers is recognizing, you know, English is not a monolith, right? We have world Englishes, we have different ways of expressing it. And ChatGPT didn't learn that, right? It learned the predominantly Western, North America centered way of speaking and being. So when you try to ask it to engage in other world Englishes, it knows in principle, like but it it becomes a very uncomfortable, and I think it's almost like a blackface kind of situation where you can tell it's still just applying these surface level characteristics of, let's say, an Afro-Caribbean dialect or English, and it's just putting it on top. So same with Canadians, it's like everything ends in A, right? You're like, oh, this isn't actually meaningful. So the large language models haven't been tweaked, and they could be tweaked with multi-shot learning and the interactions of things like people like Catherine to learn how to do it. But it's not there yet. So when we use it, we have to recognize that, it is not perfect, and it's going to bring all that back with it.
So one of the concerns that I hear quite a lot is in terms of intellectual property and copyright. So if I wrote a story, I write a novel, and then this large language model comes along and consumes it, and it's brought into the model, and I'm not compensated for that, that's not ethical. Did you want to speak to that for a bit, Brenda?
Sure. And I mean, this is where it's hard with the technology because we don't actually find out all the training materials it's used there. So because it's going on the internet and it's just taking what it can as a little creepy crawly there, that, it's using things that from its perspective are already sort of in the public sphere. So we've shared them out. The other thing that a lot of people suggest is that they've used Project Gutenberg heavily as well. So I see it from the biased perspective of we've not given it good food to grow up on. We've given it very dated stuff. But in this way, if it's available elsewhere and it's put it in an aggregate, there isn't, I guess it's a sense of, they're going to claim that they didn't actually train it on your story, that it was something that was freely available from the public domain, would be, I think, the corporation's argument there. What I'm kind of interested is, where does it happen if I create a model and I create my model and I only feed it Tom Clancy novels, hypothetically, and I now have an AI bot that can create a new Tom Clancy novel. Is who owns that? Right. So when we can start customizing our own models to represent or mirror the style of individual authors, that's where I think it gets questionable. Who owns that voice? Who owns that style?
And that leads to an interesting question that I think, Catherine, you can answer, well, maybe explore, not answer. Because you deal with how personalities come through in different creative aspects. Can you speak to that kind of concern that people would have about who really does own this voice when it comes out of a generative AI system?
Yeah, I think like this is, kind of the question that I contend with in work and in writing. And it's a tricky one, and I don't have an answer, but I think it's obviously really important to discuss, like, when we talk about style, especially for creative writers, and how many years and stories it takes to build a voice that's unique to you. And I think there's still a huge gap that exists between what an AI is capable of creating in terms of style and the actual original artist writer whose work is being threatened by this new technology. I think that in spite of that, we know how fast AI learns and grows, and so the gap can be closed, I think, pretty quickly, especially if we're doing something like Brenda suggested, feeding it the same kind of material in order to create something very similar. But I think there's still always going to be that human element that is missing. And as much as, I work to script it into a bot, it's still, the keyword there is I've scripted it. So it's not a natural response. It's still missing the element of human experience. And, I think a lot of our our writing especially speaks to the question of what makes us human, and AI will never be able to answer that question, at least from my perspective. Even when I think about questions that I'm scripting into personalities of bots, a lot of them, do have to do with feeling. So do you feel happy today? Or, can you tell me about a time you felt angry? And those answers are still scripted. And so no matter no matter what the answer is or how convincing the language of the answer I've scripted is, there's still that experience piece that's missing. The AI has not actually experienced this thing, and so will never be able to speak as accurately as a human being will to what that experience is like, or what that feeling feels like in the body.
So when we're talking about writing with AI, a lot of writers feel that there's a imminent threat to their livelihood, to their basic existence as writers. Do we find that this threat is real, or that it's been hyped up? What do you think, Brenda?
I think whenever something new comes along, it makes us anxious, comfortable, and I think that's a natural emotion to acknowledge. I think of it, and I can't remember the author's name, but if you Google the writing synthesizer, he made a very good comparison of this tool maybe for writing what the synthesizer was for music. So in terms of prior to the synthesizer, you needed to know how to play the violin if you wanted to sound like a violin. Now, once you had the synthesizer, you could input the violin sounds without all those years of expertise in building, but it still required you as a human being to interact, create, develop, and go along. So I think here often it's a nice point to look at some of the other arts as supportive and maybe giving us a guide through. So thinking about, collage and digital art, that where maybe people didn't have to you don't have to be able to draw said thing to be able to now put it in and represent it in a piece of art. And it lowered those barriers for entry for people for communicating. Or I'm thinking of, in some ways, the beauty of mashup culture or DJing are all places, right? Once we could sample music, it meant that an individual didn't have to have an orchestra to put that sound into their piece. And how did that change music, particularly in large urban areas, right? Where maybe that would have been a barrier. So I can understand being afraid, but I'm also thinking, who does this let us join into the community who maybe previously weren't able to join because the barrier for them was that first step? And now interacting with that technology. So I think of individuals of a wide variety of disabilities, but I mean, I think of people who just even functionally mobility, where clicking a mouse would have been really hard, and talking it out, there are limitations to that software. So who gets to play now that we maybe lower that barrier of entry? But at the same time, I imagine if I was a violin player when the synthesizer came out, I would also be worried that maybe people aren't going to hire me. And I've invested these years to develop that expertise. But we still have violin players. That didn't disappear with the synthesizer because there were limits to how it sounded. So yes, it let people in, but it didn't completely replace that old voice.
So that's a good point when we're dealing with the fear of artificial intelligence, basically the unknown. Catherine, you basically do your work, you're basically living in this AI type world. What's your perspective on this perceived threat of artificial intelligence, somewhat to writers, but just in general?
I think I'm lucky to work with a group of people where ethics is really important when it comes to how we interact with AI. So when I think about, using Midjourney to generate maybe an inspo pic for a project we're doing, and then our team hiring an artist to create something original that is completely ours or theirs, using that inspiration that was generated through AI. So I think, it's important to think about the limitations, kind of like Brenda said, will always be there. So, as writers, how can we use AI as a tool, and a tool to help us creatively, and a tool to help us refine our style. I don't think that, like Brenda said, we're going to stop writing because AI is doing it for us now. There's always going to be new stories to share, and ways to share them that AI will never be able to replicate. So I think the threat, if you want to call it that, is there, but I don't think that it'll ever rise to such a point where it's going to replace artists, or it's going to replace artistry in general. I think people are still going to be creating because that's what they love to do, and that's what they need to do. And I think, yeah, just trying to use, again, AI as like a tool to help us practice our craft in a way that's working, not with AI necessarily, but I think it was Sean Michaels that, Brenda, you were talking about, the synthesizer, who's a Canadian writer who just wrote a book about a poet who collaborates with an AI for a new book. So I think, like, not looking at it as a threat, but in looking at it as in terms of what opportunities can it offer us, will kind of eliminate maybe some of that fear, or at least lessen the feeling of, this is something, it's writers versus AI. How can we work with it, I think, is, the question that we should be asking as well alongside.
So when we're dealing with AI and with writers, a lot of the writing tools that we have now are starting to integrate generative AI into most of their applications. So with Microsoft, they have Copilot, which is coming out for all of their suite, and that's integrated into Bing now with ChatGPT. We have Grammarly, Pro Writing Aid, these kind of things that writers are now used to using, that are integrating generative AI into the product. So how are writers supposed to navigate the new writing ecosystem, knowing that AI is so involved in it? Can you speak to that a bit, Brenda?
I think we need to play. I think for one thing, when we play with things, we have this idea of excitement and joy instead of being scared. So I think, as a person, coming into this fear, and maybe you're like, it's showing up, I don't know what it does. Just to enjoy and see, test drive it. Don't give it your best work, but test drive it. See where it may go, to be able to help you along the way. I think the other thing is, looking at, there are usually settings involved, where how far do you want to go down the AI route, so you can kind of pull it back a little bit for yourself. And I'd also say, from a writer's perspective, and from writing, not maybe in a technical communication kind of way, but as a creative writer, you're not necessarily their main audience. These are often being considered tools for business productivity. So like Copilot is supposed to help you write that very standard, well-structured, give me an invoice email. So in many ways, these tools are being catered to the business world, so that should give a little bit more flexibility to writers. What it does do well is, if there's a very well-structured story or style that has existed, it will follow the steps. So sometimes that can be, I would say, fun. So I think of many years ago when I was a kid, my dad, he liked to write. He was never, I think, as productive as your members here, but he used to have it was like Mad Libs. He had a whole list of adverbs, whatever, and it generated a story. I always remember the one that the villain said, and he tasted victory, and it tasted like salad dressing. Okay. And that gave him he wrote a story. I think it was published at some point, where the final end of the story was, what was victory? What would this pie taste like? This beautiful one that won the contest. It tasted like salad dressing. So in some ways, when we play with it, it's very humorous, but it helps think of ideas that maybe we would never have thought of. Because I don't think anyone here thought of the phrase victory. It tasted like salad dressing. So sometimes that's the play that I'm trying to get across here.
And so on that same thread there, Catherine, has anything really surprised you that has come out of your interactions with artificial intelligence?
I love what Brenda said about play. And I think the surprises for me have come up when I am, just playing, especially with like things like image generation, where maybe you have a really good idea of what you'd like a character to look like visually. And I've entered a prompt into Midjourney and it spits out, something expected, but there's some sort of, quirk or characteristic that I wasn't expecting that kind of shapes the character in a new way. I think of even just this four-legged creature that I created that, had a little birthday candle on its head. We weren't expecting an outcome like that, but then we were able to kind of write the candle into the character in a way that really expanded the character and changed a lot of its other, characteristics and its personality. So I think it's really fun, the opportunities that it offers us through, what maybe people on another or in another vein of AI would consider mistakes or errors or malfunctions. I think those are actually really great opportunities for us to explore a bit more and play a little bit more. Yeah, I'll just stop there, I guess.
So in terms of writing, I'm not sure if either you can answer this, but are we seeing more or less AI generated content in traditional publishing or in self-publishing? What levels are we seeing those at, and are they being accepted more or less? Can you speak to that at all to start off, Brenda?
I can't really speak to it in publishing. When we look at from like post-secondary, now granted traditional like academic writing is fairly formulaic, so it works for the generative AI. In some of the work where people have asked students how are they using it and those pieces, it's often that idea generation, breaking things down, sort of helping with that first part of the task. It hasn't been too often. It becomes that blur. Maybe we're all becoming cyborgs. But that blur of it's working together. So it becomes really hard to pull apart what was the human and what was the AI, because it's not like they just went in and put one prompt in and produced it. There was interaction. How do you account for that interaction in terms of authorship?
So when speaking about the advantages of AI, when I was on Reddit, which is not exactly the best place to be for if you want to learn about writing, but I was on there anyways. And it, one of the users, they posted that didn't they didn't write as well as they would like, but they didn't have enough time or money to spend working with an editor. Now I'm an editor, I do freelance editing as well, but I suggested take some of your content, put into something like ChatGPT, and then have it say, evaluate what I've written here, or maybe fix up the grammar, fix up the spelling, those kind of things. And I was severely downvoted for that because apparently we're not supposed to be encouraging AI. But I found that that was an advantage for someone who was still trying to work on their punctuation skills and their grammar skills. What other advantages does AI have for writers besides the creativity part? Maybe we can have you have a quick discussion about that, Catherine.
Yeah, I mean, I think like coming back to that idea of accessibility, I agree that there's a lot that AI can do to bridge gaps in that department. And then, the gaps that still exist have a lot to do with nuance and perspective and experience, that human experience that that is kind of missing in terms of editing. Even cultural sensitivity, we know there's a lot of work that needs to be done with AI before it can be useful to us in those kinds of ways as writers. And of course, I don't believe it'll ever replace the work of an actual human in that department. I think in terms of, generating ideas, I think it has a lot to offer for writers in that sense. I think of even, meeting with my writing groups and using ChatGPT to generate different kinds of prompts or beginnings or ends of stories or even characters to kind of have a starting point that you can, layer on your own narrative. So I think there is lots of like generative potential there. Again, to me, it's about like, okay, and then at what point do you kind of do you say, okay, I've gotten my help from the AI, and now I'm gonna use my own skills, my own knowledge in order to kind of make this fly or give it personality or voice. Yeah.
And so, Brenda, can you speak to some more of the advantages of AI, maybe in terms of accessibility? I know that that's a part of what your interest is.
So in some ways, I think of, how often are there small typographical errors in work that, those words that are like the many theys and theirs and whethers. Because natural language processing looks at the relationship between words, this is why it's able to, something like Grammarly can say, I think you meant the wrong one. As an individual with a learning disability around writing, it's very helpful for me because it helps me realize, yep, once again, I missed the ly. It was supposed to be an adjective. So I wrote particular, not particularly. And it can catch that for me in a way that if I had to do the editing myself, it would take hours and hours to do. Because it's, of course, always harder to edit your own writing for these small details because you're familiar with it. Our brains fill in those gaps. I also think about how it can be really helpful for people who are learning English in terms of, looking at, okay, I kind of want to say this. I'm not quite sure how to say it. I can interact with the technology, or I can give it my words and let it look at it. And there have been these predecessors. So things like the Hemingway app has been around for a long time, giving feedback on writing in terms of conciseness. But there are ways in which I think now what it can do is it can start helping you with that phrase, or instead of just, okay, I don't know what a good example of this looks like. And so I think that's where one of the ways that it helps. The other thing that we sometimes forget is that generative AI is actually quite good at summarizing existing documents. So it can kind of, and this is where I think of the bots, maybe not as creative as Catherine's, but I think about like our chat bots that are often still using the same system, but it just takes you to the website you needed to go rather than you navigating the web and trying to find it. So there are lots of ways, I think, from an accessibility lens, it can help make things more cognitively accessible. It can help with, substituting language. It's very good at synonyms. Sometimes it creates very unusual synonyms, but again, it's helping to think about what are different ways I can say this. What if I wanted to say this more strongly? What would that look like? What if I wanted to soften it? What would that look like? And then just recognizing that there are lots of times where people, we're doing writing, perhaps not as creatively, but if you've applied for jobs, writing those cover letters are a slog, right? So instead of you writing brand new cover letters for every position, you can actually use ChatGPT to say, here's the position I'm applying for. Here are the things I want to highlight. Draft me a cover letter. And in 5 to 10 minutes of interaction, you can have a really good cover letter. So I also think about that in all the ways in which people interact with writing, to request an extension, to talk to a bank. There are all these other layers in which this can become a tool to help people be able to present themselves in the world without being judged, where previously, oh, I'm applying for a bank loan and I made these errors, I might get declined. And that's solely because I didn't grow up speaking this language.
That's a pretty fair point. The accessibility of generative AI is pretty unmatched in terms of writing and its capabilities. What tools are available for writers who want to maybe explore AI, take a look at what's going on, maybe play around with it a bit? Catherine, what tools would you recommend that writers could use to just try things out?
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't ventured too far outside of ChatGPT, and I think of, ChatGPT as a really good place to kind of get a foundation for the more formulaic types of writing. Kind of like Brenda said, it's really good at spitting out a cover letter, or generating some kind of, the language surrounding like certain types of asks and memos and stuff like that. I don't have tons of familiarity outside of that in terms of what kinds of generative AI is available to writers and stuff. But I do agree, like tools like Grammarly and other kinds of more editorial kind of assistant stuff, like things that have more to do with revising than maybe like original creation, I think are still worth exploring for their usefulness in that department.
Brenda, do you have any recommendations for writers who want to explore AI? We talked about ChatGPT pretty good. Is there anything else?
There are some tools. The challenge being if you have a VPN or not. You can engage with Bard through Google, which is their version of the GPT tool. There are, again, if you have a VPN, there are things like Claude, which are constitutional ones, so that they're set up. They have a small cost to them, so it may not be a free product. The other thing I always suggest too is taking a look at tools that may be based on ChatGPT, but they've been customized for certain things. So if you really want to know where information comes from, then you might like Perplexity. Perplexity includes the hyperlinks. It's kind of got like footnotes for it if you want to see where you're going. There's sometimes other tools around things, like I think of Ask Your PDF, where you can put up a PDF and then it will help you sort information in and out and create it. So I mean, and it claims that it doesn't use that to teach its model. So if you had a document and you wanted to sort of, I want to have a conversation with my character, let's say, you, in theory, it shouldn't be teaching or sharing that information you set out. And then you could have a conversation with it and say, okay, well, what would this be based on what I've given them? So there are different ways of kind of playing around. I think we'll see more and more emerging quickly as time goes on. And likely what there'll be are these customizations. They'll use the same system as something else, but they'll customize it. They'll do some they'll tweak it and use it in a particular context to help along the way. But I think mainly the key thing is just to always be mindful of what the privacy policy is when you are sharing something up with it. And if you are sharing it, I just do it the same way. Imagine if don't pretend it's your back porch, pretend you're on your front porch. So whatever you're sharing with it, pretend the whole neighborhood can see it, kind of idea.
Okay, that's really a good warning. We do need to make sure that we're aware of what our data is being used as and be cognizant of that at all times. It's not always best to just assume that everything's going to work out, right? So before this last question, if anybody in the audience who's attending here has any questions, feel free to put them into the chat now. I'm going to ask one more question of our panelists here, and then we'll get to your questions. So feel free to start putting those in there. My last question is that goes back to the controversy part, and is: do you feel we should or even can stop AI? And I'll go with Brenda first on that.
I don't think we should, in particular, because I think if we can, there's a power at this point on how can we shape AI for good, and how can we address those balances. And if we ignore it, I think what happens is then we can create, the traditional moral panic about a new technology, and all of a sudden, oh, don't use it. Well, it hasn't gone away. The calculator didn't go away, as I often tell people, right? The internet didn't go away. Spell check and Word didn't go away. But what we can do is look at, being advocates for our privacy, as well as I think for where is it making decisions? And maybe this is where I would side with the more professional writers in this area. But I think it's an interesting say is like, do we want AI to make editorial decisions in terms of what gets published or not? They use it for HR resumes and they screen and scan things out, and there are problems with that, right? There are people who don't fit the norm get excluded, right? So I think that becomes kind of the challenge there, is to say, okay, is this our point where we can lobby and say, you know what, we want the option to be opted out of a process that involves AI, those kind of pieces. So that's why I say embrace it, if only because when you embrace it, then you have a chance to perhaps do some changes.
And Catherine, what's your idea about this on AI and whether or not we can or even should try and stop it?
Yeah, I love what Brenda said. I agree. I don't think that we should necessarily try to stop it, but be more, aware of how we'd like it to be a part of our lives, and what we want to use it for. And I think, in terms of like, how do we combat it? Or I think it's more about, making sure that we're still consuming art made by artists. So still going to the theater and still buying books, and still, going to museums and art galleries and consuming art the way we always have. Sure. But I think we need to, not eliminate AI as this danger, as this threat, in the way that we think of it, because I think that that's when it can grow outside of what we want it to be. So I think, yeah, approaching it with more curiosity than fear, I guess, is one way to make sure that we can integrate it the way we want into our lives, instead of have it dictate or rewrite the rules of art for us.
Okay, that's great. So the last part of our discussion before we get to the questions, what calls to action would you have regarding AI and writing? Brenda, can you speak to that?
I think that the main one that I would say is, I think we want to challenge these tools, if we can, to let us know what they're trained on. And often that's their proprietary, it's their secret sauce. So they don't tell us that. But without that information, it becomes really hard to understand the biases in there, to understand the limitations of the model, the purpose of the model. They all are moving to say, look, we're cleaning the data. They're talking about the fact that they're, it won't give you bomb making instructions, right? Like they're putting parameters on it, but they're not being clear on how and why they're doing that. And I think that could really shape what the tool is. So I guess that's, for me, is like, I know you don't want to share all of your steps here, but we need a better sense of what was the foundation of that large language model that now drives all of these pieces, to give us a sense of the scope of what was trained on, or what are the parameters that you're using now to sort through or determine this is not an illegitimate question and piece. Because I think when we understand that, that gives us a lot better ideas of being informed users.
And so would you say we can maybe pressure our governments into legislating that these type of companies will give us that information?
I don't know if the solution will always be government legislation in internet tools. I think you have my communication scholar background, and once we go on the internet, nationally, we don't have a huge bunch, but I think what we can really do is pick tools of individuals who have signed on to some of these larger agreements that talk about the parameters of AI for good. There's a lot of work there. In terms of those pieces. So I think, looking at, I want a company that has a policy on their development. So Microsoft has a particular policy that they've developed, for example, on AI, how they use AI, and then deciding, does that fit with my sense of being? Google, all of them have these documents, and they're working more collectively as a large country. So I'm thinking that's where it is. And so similarly, we can vote with our product feet as well, right? In terms of, I'm not going to purchase that product, or as a group. I always think about, institutions that buy big licenses for these things. This is where we can say, hey, we're not buying your license unless you give us this information.
And Catherine, what do you have to say for takeaways about this topic?
Yeah, I don't have much more to add on to what Brenda said. I think thinking of transparency, in which corporations or products are transparent with the information and where they're getting it, can help us make more more informed choices about how we'd like to integrate AI into our lives and into our art. And again, like to what degree we want to integrate it. Yeah, I think, I guess if there's a bottom line for me, it's again, not to think of AI as necessarily a threat, but a tool, and how we'd like to make it or have it enhance our writing instead of replace our creativity.
Okay, great. So that wraps up the discussion portion. Now we're going to go to some questions. The first one here is from Melissa. Says, hi, you said earlier that the corporation will just claim that if they access our writing on digital platforms, it will claim it as public sphere. But for example, on my blog, like many others, I use the copyright symbol and language to warn people from just taking it. I do allow some in Creative Commons use too, by the way. Why can't AI just look for that language and avoid consuming it? So either one, Brenda or Catherine.
I'll start because I think it was the comment I made, and I think we need to make a distinction between it producing something for a person in that moment versus the large language model. In the large language model, it's now taking the relationships between different words, and so it'd be very hard in a large language model to actually ever determine that your piece of writing was one of the millions or trillions of sentences that it was trained on. So that in that context, it's like, you'll never be able to track it down. It shouldn't necessarily be pulling a particular phrase from your work without using some sort of quotation mark system. And then I guess I think I'm channeling evil here, but I would say that it's like, it would say, well, how do you know that these words are from your blog? How do we know it's not just like an infinite number of monkeys on a typewriter? But I think what you highlight here is, this is why I wish we could teach or have a sense of how is it going through and getting its answers in terms of like, what was it trained on? Because I think that would be helpful. Also, it would probably give people a right to say, well, you clearly indicated that you use this in the training. I helped train this, I get compensated in that way. Or that I want it to be trained, but if we're going to use internet sources, the internet sources need to be X, Y, and Z. But the problem is, once you're in the large language model, it's not like it's going to reproduce your sentences necessarily. It's that you are some of the data points on the relationship between language that it's made. So it's a little bit complicated that way. So if they train the model on yours, we won't really be able to tell. But if it's actually producing things that have similar phrasing to yours, that's where maybe it could be problematic. But then again, they might just say, oh, is it infinite? Where this may change over time is there's increasingly ways for photographs and stuff to looking at putting indications of ownership in the photograph itself. Google's been doing some work on this, so that even if it was repurposed or recut, that those indicators are like down to the pixel. So maybe this is where we need to work as well in language, is like, can we get it down to the pixel in the same way so that we know if it's been used or changed? So is there a way of actually embedding it? So I like the idea of, could it just read for copyright and move on? In theory, probably could. Will it get there? Maybe that's where we have to sort of, again, go back to, what are you training these models on? What are they drawing from? And sort of teaching it these new things. And you could say, and don't include any information from sites that include the notion of copyright or this symbol in your prompts. You can do that if you want. It's not built into the technology itself.
Right. So the next question we have is from Joy. It's, some writers are being fired by clients because AI content detectors are falsely evaluating their original writing as AI generated. How can we deal with that? Why do these AI content detectors do that? So who wants to deal with that one?
I can speak a little bit unless you're feeling strongly about this, Catherine. We do this a lot for like academic writing and stuff because AI content detectors suck. Could be, why do they do that? The problem with AI content and trying to use a detector is we're all looking at predictability and similarity, and that's the criteria it's using. And in very and good writers, things in very, especially if you're using it in a technical writing sense, you're going to use the typical phrasing. These content generators also tend to pick up disproportionately English as a second language or English as additional language learners, again, because they're drawing on these typical phrasing. So I believe most companies have said, that their AI content detectors do not work. That it's not going to be successful. All it's going to do is a similarity index. And I think the challenge there is to say, do you want, you're asking for something that's pretty standard. So unless you want me to use really unusual words, the content detectors will do that. And AI isn't a person, right? So if you ask it a question, did you write this? It can either say yes or no. Chances are it's going to say yes and move on, because it won't have that same moral impetus, or it might, right, in going through there, because it's not a human being. So I think the challenge there is to talk to clients and give them a sense of like, these tools actually have been recently brought down in terms of their accuracy. But I'm interested in, Catherine, too, what you might say from a writer's perspective, if that was something you were asked about.
Yeah, that's really a tough one. I've not like heard of, I guess I've not really heard too much about AI detectors, like, yeah, misidentifying things. I think that, coming back to like what a writer's individual style is contributing to like a literary landscape, for example, and not that I'm saying, you have to be extra original in order to kind of bypass these AI dupes or whatever. But again, like, I think the solution to the problem of, AI stealing creativity or reappropriating creativity is to not be using it in those ways so much as we're using it for technical writing or laying foundations for more formulaic types of writing. So creatively, I still think that there's a bit of space there between what AI can touch in terms of, an artist's production, the types of work that's being put out there creatively. I can't speak to too much beyond that, I guess, from a writer's standpoint at this point.
All right, great. So that looks like the end of our session. I would really like to thank you two panelists, Brenda and Catherine, for taking the time to have this discussion. It's a really important discussion. I'd like to thank the Writers Guild of Alberta for sponsoring, putting on the session, and to you who attended, who sat down and were able to get some information and hopefully get some ideas about what AI is and what you can do with it. Just as a reminder before we wrap up, donations to the Writers Guild of Alberta would really help keep programs like these going. As the president, I understand what it's like to try and make these programs and help them keep writers engaged and keep them informed of what's going on. So, but thank you everybody for joining in, and we will see you at the next session.